All right, and we're back. We're back talking about the nitrogen cycle this time. So here you can see the nitrogen cycle. Something to really think about, the Earth's atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen. All right, it is by far the gas that has the greatest concentration in our atmosphere. The next closest is oxygen, which is at 21%. And then you've got that 1% that is, all of these different trace gases. So, carbon dioxide, methane, all kinds of gases that you find in the atmosphere. Those are really only 1%. It's just a small trace, but it's primarily nitrogen. In its pure gas form, though, we're talking about nitrogen, it can't be used by living organisms. So we got all this nitrogen up in the atmosphere, and in its pure gas form, it can't be used, which is unfortunate. However, we do have the nitrogen cycle to allow for the usage of that gas. Producers get their nitrogen, they can't get it from the air, so there has to be a process by which nitrogen is converted from that atmospheric nitrogen into usable nitrogen by producers. Because it's unusable for all organisms, there are some bacteria that have evolved the ability to add hydrogen atoms to nitrogen to create ammonia. Okay? So we've got this nitrogen in the atmosphere that gets broken up and released through electrical storms. So lightning can actually break up that N2 molecule. So this is really N2. So you have these electrical storms that take place in the atmosphere that breaks those things up, and they wind up coming down here into the soil. So this process of creating ammonia from atmospheric nitrogen is called nitrogen fixation. So this process right here, creation of ammonia in soil, is nitrogen fixation. So there's lots of different types of nitrogen fixing bacteria. Some are free-living soil bacteria. Others are nitrogen-fixing symbiotic bacteria that live in the roots of some species of plants. And in the oceans, a major source of nitrogen fixation is cyanobacteria, which are sometimes called blue-green algae. So you've got ammonia being created here in the soil. You can also have ammonia being created in here using cyanobacteria in the ocean, which is usually blue-green algae. All of these bacteria are fixing nitrogen for their own use, but they also release excess ammonia that can be used by other organisms. And of course, they can be directly consumed by other organisms and pass that fixed nitrogen up the food chain, kind of like what we talked about in the carbon cycle, where plants get eaten and then small animals get eaten. That carbon gets passed up the food chain. Same deal with the nitrogen here. So taking a look at the next step here in the nitrogen cycle, the next step is going to be what's known as nitrification. And nitrification has to take place because ammonia isn't just used by plants and producers to make organic molecules. Some aerobic bacteria can use ammonia as an energy source, so they oxidize ammonia to be able to make nitrite, which then can be further oxidized by other bacteria to make nitrate. And that's this right here. So these bacteria right here are oxidizing this ammonia, and it's creating nitrite, which in turn can be further oxidized to create nitrates. The process by which, like we said, ammonia is converted to nitrite and then to nitrate is called nitrification. Fortunately, plants and other producers, they can also use nitrite and nitrate as sources of nitrogen. So the nitrification doesn't necessarily change the amount of available nitrogen in the environment. It just changes the oxidation state of it. But there are still other bacteria that use nitrate as a source of oxygen, and then they convert that nitrate back into atmospheric nitrogen in a process called denitrification. Okay? So what we get here is this denitrification process takes place here, and then boom, denitrification by bacteria happens up here. Okay, so denitrification is a way for nitrates in soil to go back into the atmosphere. Okay, nitrification by bacteria is a way for nitrogen to come from the atmosphere into the soils. Okay, so let's look at an example of a nitrogen cycle in a typical, let's say, terrestrial ecosystem. So over here we've got a typical terrestrial ecosystem. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil and in plant roots, they convert nitrogen from the atmosphere, so up here, into ammonia. So it's going down here. The ammonia is then used by plants, or it's converted to nitrite and then nitrate by nitrifying bacteria. So we go from this ammonia into the nitrate. So these bacteria right here are creating this nitrate in soil. That nitrite and nitrate can also be used by plants. The plants are then eaten by herbivores. So right here, we've got these guys eating the producers. Okay, so these furry little bunnies eat the plants, and then this fox eats the bunny. All right, so what we have is we've got this transfer of nitrogen through the food chain. Animal waste products, okay, are very high in ammonia and ammonia derivatives like urea, okay, both of which are usable sources of nitrogen for plants. So anybody who's ever had a cat before and you let the litter box go too long, it starts to get that ammonia type smell. Well, that's because their waste materials are high in ammonia. So you've got all of these guys right here putting their waste products out onto the land. They break down and they wind up forming ammonia particles. Or these guys die and they wind up decomposing on the land, forming ammonia particles. Okay? So if there is an abundance of nitrate in the soil, denitrifying bacteria can convert some of that back into atmospheric nitrogen, which is this process right here. So if we've got uptake by plants of these nitrates, but there's way too much there, denitrifying bacteria can process all that stuff and then release it back up into the atmosphere as atmospheric nitrogen. Now, if the plants in the ecosystem are crops and they're removed after the harvest, there's not going to be any animal waste or plant litter to replenish that usable nitrogen in the soil. So usually what winds up happening in agriculture is soil gets replenished by putting on fertilizers that are high in nitrates. So basically fertilizers high in nitrates, nitrites, or ammonia get put on those crops so that that nitrogen can go back into the soil. Now, there is a problem if you over-fertilize land. If you've got over-fertilizing of land, it results in a process called eutrophication. That eutrophication process occurs when there are excess nutrients that are added either to farmland, and then that farmland, it gets run off into water. So the eutrophication process is too many nutrients put on top of, so let's say right here, here's your nitrates from fertilizer. Too many nutrients and too much clearing of this causes those nutrients to run off into a water body. When it runs off into a water body, basically you're changing the balance. Okay, so there's too much nutrient inside that water body. All right, I used to live over in Ashburn Village, and the ponds that are over there, during the summertime, you'd wind up seeing a lot of algae that grows on top of the surface of the water, and that's simply because there's too much nitrogen-rich nutrient inside that water. So the algae blooms, and if you've ever heard of it, it's called an algal bloom. Okay, which can sometimes cover the entire surface of a pond or a lake. All right, these blooms produce a lot of oxygen, all right, and when it's exposed to daylight, but at night that process gets reversed. So the algae can then suck all the oxygen out of the water and it winds up suffocating aquatic animals. So it causes massive die-offs. So anytime you've seen, news stories about algal blooms, you see all these producers on the top of the water, and it's great because they're creating a whole bunch of oxygen during the day, but at nighttime that process gets reversed and they suck all the oxygen out of the water. So you wind up getting these big fish kills. Another issue that we have with too much nitrogen, another part of it is during the combustion of organic material, and that's what we're going to be talking about here, these nitrogen oxides. Okay, burning fuel, and also using inorganic fertilizers. Okay, fuels, fossil fuels like oil, coal, natural gas, other organic materials, grass, trees, brush. When they're burned, they release a lot of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides into the atmosphere. Okay, but burning coal actually releases greater quantities of these pollutants than, say, burning natural gas does. Okay. Coal is one of the dirtiest fossil fuels, okay, and natural gas is considered one of the quote-unquote cleanest. But the issue that we have here is the burning of those things. It adds that CO2, it adds sulfur dioxide, and it adds these nitrogen oxides to the atmosphere, okay, which then water molecules will then condense on those things and fall back down to Earth as acid rain. So these are some of the things about the nitrogen cycle. I highly recommend kind of going back through this, reading through, because the nitrogen cycle, because of all of its different processes and because of the fact that you have bacteria that fixate nitrogen, okay, and then you have bacteria that then take that fixed nitrogen from ammonia and create nitrites and nitrates. There's a couple of specific processes in this one, so I highly recommend that you kind of go back through this one and familiarize yourself with it. Next up is going to be the sulfur cycle, so I'll see you in a bit.